So, what do Agatha Christie and mushrooms have in common? They're both very mysterious. Welcome back to my channel. I wanted to pop in and talk about a couple of my recent reads. The first book I want to talk about, I actually listened to as an audiobook, and that was The Christie Affair by Nina de Gramont. This is one of Reese Witherspoon's book club picks, and I can see why this would have mass reader appeal. It is inspired by some real life events in Agatha Christie's life, and that's really what drew me into this story. So for those of you that are not aware, in 1926, after an argument with her husband about an upcoming divorce and his infidelity, Agatha Christie goes missing. Her vehicle is recovered with an expired license and I think some clothing in it, but she's nowhere to be found, and this prompts a nationwide search for the famous author. She is found 11 days later, but she reports that she has no memory of what happened during that 11 days, and she was registered at a hotel under the name of her husband's mistress, using the surname anyway. So this time period in Agatha's life is not really something that she talks about. It's not something that she covers in her autobiography, and she doesn't really answer any questions about it in interviews. So a lot of people speculate about what happened. Some say she had a nervous breakdown, others say she was suffering from some sort of fugue state, and others believe it was a well thought out plan of revenge, essentially to embarrass her husband and draw attention to his misdeeds. So because of that real life mystery, I was attracted to this book, and I was immediately kind of thrown off because I assumed we would be hearing from Agatha Christie herself, but this book is actually narrated by Archie Christie's mistress, Nan O'Day. Now, Nan O'Day does become a very interesting character in her own right, but I didn't really like the narration style. It is first person, and it was really unclear to me how the Nan character really knew where Agatha was, what her thoughts were, and what was going on with her. So that was a bit confusing to me, but I did enjoy the story overall. We do get a little bit of romance and a little bit of historical fiction as well, because World War I and the flu epidemic play key roles in Nan O'Day's circumstances. And we also see a murder mystery. When that part happened, I wasn't really expecting it, but I was glad it happened because I felt like the plot to the book had gotten to a point where it was becoming a bit boring and a bit redundant. I didn't care enough about the Nan character really for some of her storyline to move me, but once we added the murder mystery piece, that made the book a little bit more interesting. So I think there were some missed opportunities with it, and again, I think most people are probably going into this book assuming that you're going to hear from, Agatha Christie's perspective. Of course, this is a fictional account, but I mean, you're assuming that the narration will be by her character, and it is not. The next book that I just finished reading was a buddy read with Katie Reads and Rants, and I really enjoyed buddy reading this with her. I'm so glad that we chose to read this book. It's one of the books that I probably wouldn't really pick up on my own necessarily, so I'm glad we got to read it together, and that is Entangled Life: How Fungi Make Our Worlds, Change Our Minds, and Shape Our Futures by Merlin Sheldrake. This book really opened my eyes. I had no idea that fungi were so mysterious, complex, adaptive, cooperative, brutal, and beautiful. I just can't say enough about fungi. I am just blown away by how understudied and underdeveloped this field of study is in science. I really think after reading this book that there's a lot of untapped potential with the study of fungi, and I'm not someone who is super interested in science, so for me to say that, this book must have really done something. I was a bit apprehensive about the content and the terminology being a bit above me, but this author does a really great job of incorporating things that you may be familiar with, like truffle hunting or even movie references to make the content seem a bit more approachable. One of the things that this book really does is it challenges our view of intelligence and cognition. Even though fungi don't have a brain, they don't really have an operational center, they do have their own intelligence. They are really adept at avoidance responses and solving all of these very complex spatial and geometric problems. And I really appreciated that the author brought in a little bit of etymology. I love the history of words, and he pointed out that the Latin root for the word intelligence means to choose between, and that is what a lot of fungi does when they solve these spatial problems. This author really kind of shattered a lot of the misconceptions I think that people have about scientists, because he almost has like a very religious or mystical connection to fungi. And it was really neat just to see how much reverence he has for his field of study, and I think that really was reflected in his writing. One quote that I actually wrote down that I really liked was, "God lives just below the surface of the soil." And I think he ended a chapter with that quote. And the author ended a lot of the chapters with a sense of wonder and imagination. And even at the end of the book, he finishes with an anecdote from his childhood, which just so sweetly illustrated how his curiosity in this field began and how it was supported by his father. He basically tells the story about him and his father jumping into this pile of leaves, and he was asking questions about the leaves and the soil, and essentially his father let him ask all the questions he wanted, and he answered them to the best of his ability, and then they pretty much did their own little science experiment with some soil and some leaves and some earthworms. So I think for people reading it, it makes science a little bit more accessible. And there were parts of this book, obviously, terminology and things that are still way above me, but I really left the book feeling like I learned something and having a greater appreciation for mycology. If you're wondering why you probably don't hear a lot about fungi, one thing the author points out is that a lot of science is very plant-centered when it comes to studying nature, and I can definitely see that perspective really dominating science right now. But one major takeaway from this book is that there is so much untapped potential with fungi to clean up radioactive and toxic waste. I mean, he even talks about mushrooms that are able to grow and thrive on cigarette butts and dirty diapers. So I think the possibilities are endless. There may be hope though, because while I was reading this book, something popped up on the news about studying mushrooms in areas where they've had wildfires, I guess to try to rehabilitate the soil or something. I didn't see the whole clip because I was actually reading at the time, but I hope that's a sign that there will be more buzz about fungi. And I think maybe scientists are hesitant to touch it because there are so many unknowns. And one thing this author did was he kind of walked a fine line between trying to give you some relatable examples and not really going too far with that, kind of explaining why this is not maybe the best way to describe fungi. But one thing he used was the comparison to the internet and the Wood Wide Web, because he talked about symbiotic relationships and how a lot of our trees and a lot of our plants actually depend on fungi in order to survive. I also liked how he pointed to our attempts in the past to fit fungi into political constructs. So like during the Cold War, when they were just starting to talk about symbiotic relationships, there was a conference about it. And they started talking in these very ideological terms about fungi having capitalist or communist tendencies based on their behaviors. So I just thought that was really interesting, how our political landscape and our culture definitely impacts how we study science and how we look at nature and things around us. So many great things in this book, and it's actually not that long. It's only about 230 pages or so, so a very short book, chock full of really interesting anecdotes, lots of cool stories about fungi, and I have such appreciation for this field of study now, and I would highly recommend this book. Even if you are someone who doesn't read science or nature books, I think this one is a must read. So that's what I finished reading this week. I am still reading Lonesome Dove. I'm almost done with that, and I'm still reading The Real Lolita. So I will probably be back next week to talk about Lonesome Dove. And then Lady Jane Books and I will be doing our live show about the 2 Lolita books. So I hope everyone is having a fantastic weekend. If you have read either of these books and have any thoughts, please shoot me a comment. I would love to hear from you guys. And thanks for watching. Hopefully I'll see you in the next one.